The moving truck rumbled slowly up the long dirt drive, its tires crunching against the gravel that had been there for decades. The driver leaned out the window, glancing at the wide stretch of land on either side. It wasn't like the manicured lawns and matching rooftops he had passed on his way in. This land was open and sprawling, framed by weathered wooden fences, with the old ranch house standing proudly at the center. The new owner stepped out of his pickup, boots settling into the dust. He stood still for a moment, taking in the sight. The house was older than anything else in the area, its timbers seasoned with age, yet still sturdy. The barn stood tall behind it, painted long ago in a deep red that had faded into a soft rust color. To him, it was beautiful. To some of the neighbors, peeking from their windows at the edges of the subdivision, it looked like a relic dropped into the middle of their neatly aligned community. The ranch wasn't just a house. It was history. The land had belonged to his family for generations, passed down from great-grandfathers who had raised cattle and cultivated fields under the same wide skies. For years it had sat empty, waiting for someone in the family to return. Now, after a long career in the city, he was that someone. He wanted quiet mornings, wide horizons, and the satisfaction of restoring the property to its former pride. Across the street, curtains twitched. A woman in a neat blouse whispered something to her husband as she pointed toward the barn. Another neighbor leaned on his fence, shaking his head slowly. They were used to strict landscaping guidelines, matching, mailboxes, and carefully edged lawns. The ranch house, with its sprawling acres and weathered charm, was unlike anything they had planned for when they moved here. The rancher noticed the looks, but didn't comment. He had expected this. Change always made people uneasy, especially when it broke the rhythm of uniformity. Instead, he turned back to the moving truck and began directing boxes into the house. Each piece of furniture carried not just comfort, but memory. An oak desk from his grandfather's study, a rocking chair that had belonged to his grandmother, and framed photographs of family standing proudly in front of the ranch in earlier years. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting a golden light across the property. He stood on the porch, looking out at the wide stretch of land. It was peaceful, exactly what he had hoped for. The gentle sound of wind moving through the trees was broken only by the distant call of a bird. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home. But as calm as the evening was, he could still feel the eyes on him. A small group of neighbors had gathered near the edge of the street, whispering in low voices. He caught fragments, words like barn, rules, and doesn't fit. Their tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the sharp edge of curiosity mixed with judgment. The rancher smiled faintly. He had expected this too. He knew what they didn't, that the ranch was more than just property. It was recognized as part of local history, protected for its age and heritage. And while the neighbors might view it as an eyesore, he saw it as a treasure. In time, he believed they would too. As the sun slipped below the horizon, he closed the porch door behind him. Tomorrow would bring more questions, perhaps even complaints. He wasn't worried. He had come prepared. For now, he allowed himself the quiet comfort of knowing that the ranch, his family's legacy, was his again. And this time, he intended to stay. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of the ranch house, casting light across the wooden floorboards. The rancher had just poured his first cup of coffee when the sound of footsteps on gravel caught his attention. Looking out, he saw a man in a bright polo shirt walking briskly toward the porch, a white envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The man didn't linger. He slid the envelope into the mailbox and left without knocking, glancing once at the barn before heading back down the road. The rancher waited until the man disappeared before stepping outside. The air was fresh with the smell of grass and earth, a welcome scent after years of city air. He pulled the envelope free and studied the bold letters across the front. Homeowners. Association notice. He wasn't surprised. It had only been a matter of time. Tucking it under his arm, he returned inside and settled at the kitchen table. The paper inside was typed neatly, with bullet points running down the page. The letter began politely enough, welcoming him to the neighborhood, but the tone quickly shifted to instructions and demands. It listed several required improvements, framed as obligations. The barn must be repainted to match the neighborhood's approved neutral tones. Fencing should be replaced with white vinyl panels, identical to those bordering other homes. The large oak trees near the road must be trimmed significantly for visual uniformity. Livestock or working animals were discouraged and subject to review. The rancher let out a quiet chuckle as he read. To someone else, the list might have been overwhelming, but to him, it was little more than noise. He folded the notice neatly and placed it beside his coffee cup. Still, the timing struck him. He hadn't even been there a full week, and already, the HOA had sent their first letter. Clearly, his arrival had stirred more concern than he realized. The neighbors who had watched him unload his furniture must have wasted no time reporting their observations. Later that morning, he walked the property, studying the barn and fences with fresh eyes. The barn's faded red paint carried more than color. It carried stories. Generations of his family had worked beneath that roof, and he had no intention of washing it away for the sake of blending in. The fences, though weathered, were strong, and the oak trees were older than any house in the subdivision. Removing or altering them would be like erasing history. At the end of the fence line, he paused to watch a pair of birds nesting high in one of the oaks. The branches stretched wide, their shadows reaching across the road. He smiled faintly. No amount of paperwork could make him see these trees as anything but irreplaceable. That evening, he placed the notice into a folder he kept on his desk. The folder already contained the property deed, historical certificates, and legal records, affirming the ranch's protected status. He slid the new letter behind them, knowing it was only the beginning. The next day confirmed his suspicion. On his way into town, he passed two neighbors standing near the community entrance. Their voices carried just enough for him to hear words like "doesn't match," "rules," and "can't let it slide." He offered them a polite nod as he drove by, though they only returned it with tight smiles. Back at the ranch that afternoon, he stood on the porch and watched the sun lower behind the barn. He felt no anger, only patience. He understood that people often resisted what they didn't understand. What they saw as a violation, he saw as preservation. In time, he thought they would learn the truth. The ranch wasn't a disruption to their order. It was the foundation of the land they all lived on. He was prepared to show them when the moment was right. For now, he let the first notice rest quietly in its folder, a small reminder that while the HOA believed they had authority over him, they didn't yet realize who held the real authority. By the third morning, the rancher had settled into a rhythm. He rose with the sun, brewed coffee in the old percolator that had been passed down through his family, and walked the grounds before the day grew too hot. The barn creaked gently as it warmed in the morning light, and the familiar sound filled him with calm. That calm was interrupted by the sound of heels clacking against the porch steps. He turned to see a woman marching up the walk with purposeful energy. She carried a clipboard pressed against her chest and wore an expression that seemed equal parts confidence and irritation. "Good morning," she announced before he could greet her. "I'm Karen. I represent the HOA. I thought I'd stop by personally to welcome you and to go over a few matters concerning your property." Her tone was friendly on the surface, but sharp beneath. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped onto the porch and glanced around, taking in every detail. Her eyes lingered on the barn, then the fences, then the oaks that stretched proudly overhead. Each pause was punctuated by the scratch of her pen against the clipboard. The rancher sipped his coffee slowly, letting the silence stretch. "Morning?" he said at last. I've read the notice. It was clear. Karen gave a practiced smile. Good, good. Then you understand the importance of bringing everything in line. We have standards here, standards that keep property values high and the neighborhood looking its best. She tapped her pen on the clipboard. That barn, for instance, it will need to be repainted in one of the approved colors, tan, beige, or light gray. Red isn't on the list. The rancher glanced toward the barn. Its red walls glowed warmly in the sunlight, the color deepened by more than a century of weather. It's been that way since my great-grandfather built it, he replied evenly. Karen's smile faltered slightly. Well, then I suppose it's overdue for an update, and those fences, they'll need replacing with white vinyl. It's standard across the neighborhood. He looked at the fences. Weathered oak posts lined the property, sturdy as ever. They had been set in place long before vinyl was invented. These have stood longer than any of us have lived here, he said. Karen's pen hovered over her clipboard. She was not used to resistance, especially not delivered so calmly. And the trees, she pressed on, pointing to the oaks. They're beautiful, yes, but they need trimming for visibility and uniformity. Overhanging branches can be a hazard. The rancher tilted his head slightly. They're older than this entire subdivision. If I touched them, it would be a loss to more than just me. Karen shifted her weight, clearly unsettled by his steady refusal to agree. She flipped a page on her clipboard and spoke with renewed authority. Look, I know you're new here, and it can take time to understand how things work, but we all follow the same rules. That's what keeps everything orderly. I'm here to help guide you so we can avoid further issues. The rancher met her, gaze, unbothered. I appreciate the welcome, he said calmly, but I've been here longer than you realize. This ranch isn't new to the area. It's part of its foundation. For a moment, Karen seemed caught off guard. Her pen stilled. She gave him another smile, this one thinner than the first. Well, I'll make a note of our conversation, but do expect a follow-up notice. We take these matters seriously. With that, she turned sharply, heels clattering down the steps, and marched back toward the street. Her clipboard was hugged tightly to her chest, as if she had gathered ammunition for a battle not yet fought. The rancher watched her go, then set his coffee mug on the porch railing. He felt no anger, only patience. He knew what she didn't. Every mark she had scribbled on that clipboard meant nothing against the documents resting in his desk drawer. The uninvited visit was just the beginning. Karen believed she was the enforcer of order, but soon she would learn that the balance of power was not at all what she imagined. By the end of the week, whispers had already taken root along the neatly trimmed streets that bordered the ranch. The neighbors who once waved politely now lingered in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices whenever the rancher passed by. Though no one spoke directly to him, he could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing closer each day. On one corner, Mrs. Fletcher watered her roses as two others leaned over the hedge beside her. He hasn't trimmed those trees, one remarked, nodding toward the towering oaks. And that barn, still the same color. I heard Karen gave him a notice. She did, Mrs. Fletcher confirmed with a small, knowing smile. And he didn't budge, just stood there drinking his coffee like nothing she said mattered. The women gasped lightly as if such calm defiance was unheard of. At the park, a group of men tossing a football exchanged their own speculations. He's stubborn, that's for sure, said one, catching the ball. Karen says he's ignoring every request. If he thinks he can just sit back and do what he wants, he's in for a surprise. But not everyone shared their disapproval. A young couple knew themselves admired the ranch as they walked their dog. I like it, the husband said quietly. It's different, has character. Everything else here looks the same, perfect boxes in a row. That place tells a story. His wife nodded. It feels like it belongs. Honestly, I'd rather look at a 100-year-old barn than another beige garage. The rancher, though silent, wasn't blind to these conversations. He noticed how some neighbors stared longer than others, how some smiled faintly in approval, while others frowned in disapproval. The ranch had become a topic of debate, dividing the neighborhood between those who prized uniformity and those who admired history. One afternoon, as he returned from town with a bag of supplies, he found two teenagers leaning against his fence, pointing at the carved initials etched into the wood. They scrambled away when they saw him, but not before he overheard one whisper, "That place is awesome. It's like stepping into the past." The rancher smiled faintly. At least some eyes saw what he saw. Meanwhile, Karen's voice carried, louder than anyone's. She had taken it upon herself to explain to nearly everyone she met that she was handling the situation. At the bakery, she spoke of uncooperative behavior. At the post office, she mentioned standards not being met. She never used the word problem, but the implication was clear. To her, the ranch was something to be corrected. The chatter didn't bother the rancher. He had lived long enough to know that opinions rose and fell with the wind. What mattered was truth, and truth was on his side. The ranch wasn't merely his. It was documented as a historic property, recognized for its heritage and its contribution to the area's history. That fact alone placed it beyond the ordinary reach of neighborhood rules. But for now, he said nothing. He listened, he observed, and he waited. The more Karen pushed, the more obvious her eagerness became to those around her. Already he could see some neighbors tiring of her constant reminders and pointed remarks. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange, the rancher sat on his porch and reflected. He could hear faint voices drifting across the street, another round of gossip circling about his barn, his fences, his trees. He let it pass, knowing that chatter was nothing without action. What they didn't realize was that he was preparing for something larger than idle talk. Every whispered complaint, every sidelong glance, every scribble on Karen's clipboard, it was all leading toward a moment he was ready to face. For now, the neighborhood could talk. Soon, though, he would speak, and when he did, the weight of his words would change everything. The weekend brought a rare stillness to the ranch. While the streets beyond buzzed with lawn mowers and children playing, the ranch itself stood quietly, a pocket of history preserved in the middle of suburban rhythm. The rancher used that calm to focus on what he knew was coming. He started in the study, a room that smelled faintly of leather and cedar. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, its surface polished smooth by years of use. On top of it lay a folder already thick with papers, documents he had been gathering carefully since the day he closed on the property. He opened it slowly, checking each page with practiced eyes. First came the deed, signed and sealed, establishing his rightful ownership. Next were the preservation certificates, each one stamped with the mark of the state's historical society. They spoke of the ranch's 150-year history, its role in the founding of the region, and the recognition it had earned as a protected heritage site. He placed them in a neat stack. The language was clear and unwavering. This property was not to be altered beyond its original character. The barn, the fences, even the towering oak trees, all were part of that character. They were not decorations to be changed at will, but living parts of history. The rancher paused, running his hand lightly over the papers. He remembered the day he received the final certificate, how proud his grandfather had been to see their land formally recognized. To his family, the ranch wasn't just property. It was legacy. Next, he added letters of approval from local preservation groups, confirming that any attempt to repaint, replace, or remove would directly violate state protections. The irony made him smile, while the HOA claimed he was breaking rules. In truth, they would be the ones crossing lines if they pushed too far. At the very back of the folder sat a single envelope that held something even more significant, a letter of appointment, signed by the retiring HOA president. The rancher had been chosen as successor months before he even moved in, though the announcement had yet to reach the wider neighborhood. He had accepted the role quietly, knowing that timing would be everything. For now, he kept that page hidden. Revealing it too soon would only cause chaos. Instead, he chose patience, letting Karen and the others build their assumptions unchecked. The more they spoke, the more dramatic the truth would become when the time was right. In between reviewing documents, the rancher spent his afternoons tending to the land. He patched a section of fence where the wood had loosened, carefully preserving the original posts rather than replacing them. He checked the barn doors, ensuring they swung smoothly on their hinges. He even trimmed a few lower branches on the oaks, not for conformity, but to keep them healthy. His work was deliberate, thoughtful, almost ceremonial. Each task reminded him why he had come here, why he was willing to face whatever pressure the HOA tried to apply. This wasn't just about resisting change for the sake of pride. It was about protecting something that could never be rebuilt once it was lost. At night, he sat on the porch with a lantern glowing softly beside him, the folder resting within arm's reach. He would flip through the papers once more, then close them carefully, always keeping them ready. He imagined the meeting where those papers would finally be shown. He pictured the expressions of surprise, the silence that would follow, and the moment when Karen's confident voice would falter. He didn't relish embarrassing her or anyone else, but he knew clarity had to come, and it would come through facts, not arguments. The rancher had no need for loud defiance. His preparation spoke for him. Every document was a shield, every certificate a reminder that the land was bigger than any single person's opinion. As the days passed and whispers in the neighborhood grew louder, the rancher simply waited. When the next meeting came, he would be ready. And when the truth was revealed, there would be no doubt left about where authority truly rested. The evening of the monthly HOA meeting arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the neighborhood itself held its breath. Porch. Lights glowed softly across the cul-de-sac, and the faint hum of air conditioners filled the summer air. Inside the clubhouse, rows of folding chairs had been arranged in a neat circle, with a long table at the front where the board usually sat. The rancher entered quietly, nodding to a few neighbors on his way in. Some offered polite smiles, others avoided his eyes, unsure where they stood. He carried nothing more than the leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. Karen was already there, perched at the front, with her clipboard resting squarely before her. She wore a blazer this time, as if to emphasize her authority. Her voice carried across the room as she greeted each person who entered, making sure they saw her in her element. When the seats filled and the low chatter settled, Karen rose to open the meeting. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her tone smooth and rehearsed. "We have a few regular updates to share, but before we get into that, I'd like to address a matter that has drawn quite a bit of attention lately, the old ranch property." The rancher remained still, his folder resting across his lap. Karen gestured toward him briefly, then continued. "As you know, our neighborhood has standards we all agree to follow. These standards are not meant to restrict, but to preserve harmony and protect property values. Unfortunately, the new owner has so far failed to comply with several of these standards. The barn is painted in a non-approved color. The fencing does not meet material requirements, and the trees remain untrimmed in a way that could pose a risk. A few neighbors nodded, murmuring agreement. Others shifted uneasily, avoiding the rancher's gaze. Karen pressed on. "We issued a notice, and I personally visited to discuss these matters. So far, no adjustments have been made. We cannot allow one property to disregard what the rest of us uphold. Therefore, I propose we take the next step and file a formal demand for compliance." Her words hung in the air. The neighbors glanced at one another, some frowning, others whispering. It was clear the room was divided, half convinced by her urgency. The other half hesitant to challenge the man who had remained so quiet but steady since moving in. At last, the chairperson of the meeting cleared his throat. Would the property owner like to respond before we move forward? All eyes turned to the rancher. He rose slowly, not rushing, the folder still in his hand. His voice was calm when he spoke. I appreciate the concern, he said evenly. And I appreciate those who want to maintain the character of this place. I agree with that goal. But what I think many don't realize is that this property is not like the others. It carries history older than this entire neighborhood. That history is protected, not just by me, but by state law. He opened the folder and placed the first set of documents on the table. The deed, the certificates, the preservation approvals, their official seals glinted under the fluorescent lights. These papers confirm the ranch as a recognized heritage site, he continued. The barn, the fencing, the trees, they are part of that recognition. They cannot be altered without permission from the State Historical Office, which, I assure you, will not grant approval for vinyl fences or beige paint. A hush fell over the room. Neighbors leaned forward, squinting at the documents as if the weight of the seals themselves told the truth more loudly than his words ever could. Karen's expression tightened, her smile faltering. She leaned over the table, flipping quickly through the pages. Well, she said slowly, this is unexpected. But even so, we have neighborhood standards. The rancher interrupted, not harshly but firmly. And I respect those standards. But the law respects history more. I'm not here to fight against the neighborhood. I'm here to protect something we all can be proud of. The chairperson cleared his throat again, this time with a note of authority. It seems clear these documents change the matter. We'll need to review them carefully before any action is considered. The rancher nodded once, then returned to his seat, leaving the folder on the table for all to see. For the rest of the meeting, the conversation shifted uneasily back to budgets and landscaping, but no one's mind was on those things. Eyes kept, drifting toward the folder, toward the man who had quietly and confidently shifted the balance of the room without raising his voice. Karen's pen tapped nervously against her clipboard. For the first time, she didn't look entirely in control. The following week, the clubhouse filled again. Word of the last meeting had spread quickly, and even those who usually skipped such gatherings came out, curious to see how events would unfold. The rancher arrived quietly, as always, carrying his folder, though this time it seemed lighter in his hand. Karen, on the other hand, was more animated than ever. She stood near the front with her clipboard pressed firmly to her chest, speaking in low but hurried tones to anyone who would listen. We can't let one property set a precedent, she insisted to a small group. If he thinks he can just flash some old papers and get away with it, what message does that send? Some nodded, but others hesitated. The official stamps and seals they'd seen at the last meeting still lingered in their minds. The chairperson called the room to order, and the chatter died down. Karen immediately rose, her voice crisp. Before we move forward, I'd like to revisit the matter of the ranch property. After reviewing the documents presented last week, I have serious concerns. Yes, the site is old, but that doesn't mean it should be exempt from the same responsibilities we all share. If anything, it needs more oversight, not less. She sat back with a satisfied air, clearly expecting her words to sway the room. The chairperson turned toward the rancher. Would you like to respond? The rancher stood, steady as always, and approached the table at the front. He placed his folder down but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, his gaze calm, meeting the eyes of his neighbors one by one. I hear the concerns, he said, and I don't dismiss them. I want you to understand that. But what I've shared with you already isn't a matter of preference. It's law. This property is protected. It's not mine alone to alter, even if I wanted to. What I've chosen is to honor that protection, to keep the ranch as it has always been." He let the words sink in before continuing. "And there's something else. Something I didn't mention last time because I wanted the facts to speak first. Tonight, I'll share it with you." The room shifted uneasily. Karen leaned forward, her pen frozen over her clipboard. The rancher opened the folder and removed a single envelope, the one he had kept sealed until now. He unfolded the paper inside and placed it gently on the table. "This," he said, "is a letter signed by the previous HOA president. It names me as the appointed successor. The transition was agreed upon months ago, and the paperwork has since been finalized." Gasps rippled across the room. A few people leaned forward, whispering to each other. Karen blinked rapidly, her confident smile gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. The chairperson adjusted his glasses, studying the letter carefully. The signature was unmistakable, the date clear. He looked up at the rancher with a slow nod. "It seems this is in order. Which means, as of now, you are the acting president." The room erupted in low, stunned conversation. Neighbors turned to one another, some surprised, some oddly relieved. The rancher remained still, his expression steady. Karen finally found her voice. This must be a mistake. He's new here. How could he possibly—" The rancher raised a hand gently, stopping her without force. "I may be new to living here, but I'm not new to leadership. I was asked to take on this role because of my background and because the board wanted someone who values both tradition and fairness. I didn't ask for the position, but I accepted it. And now it's my responsibility to guide with respect for everyone." Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. Karen sank back in her chair, her pen motionless now. The rancher closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. "My goal isn't to fight with anyone. My goal is to preserve what makes this place special while making sure every voice here is heard. That includes yours, Karen. But from this moment forward, let's make sure our discussions are rooted in respect and in truth." The neighbors watched him, and slowly, almost unexpectedly, a round of light applause began. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough, a sign that many were ready for change, ready for a steadier hand. Karen sat stiffly, her jaw set, but her protests no longer carried the same weight. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. For the first time since moving in, the rancher didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like exactly what he had become, the one who now held the reins. The days following the meeting carried a new energy across the neighborhood. Conversations that once circled around complaints now drifted toward curiosity. Neighbors who had only seen the ranch from the street found themselves wondering about the history behind its weathered fences, the old barn, and the towering oaks. Rancher noticed the shift immediately. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, like a tide turning. People waved more when he passed. Some stopped to ask simple questions. When was the barn built? Who planted the first oak? How long had the ranch been standing? He answered each question patiently, always careful to share the heritage without making it sound like a lecture. One Saturday morning, he invited a few families to walk the property with him. Children ran through the tall grass, laughing as they chased each other along the fence line. Parents marveled at the craftsmanship of the barn, its beams still sturdy after a century and a half. He explained how his grandfather had taught him to mend fences without replacing the original wood, and how the Preservation Society required every repair to honor the original structure. What had once been seen as non-compliance began to look in the neighbor's eyes like something rare, something worth protecting. Karen, however, remained distant. She still attended meetings, still took notes on her clipboard, but her once commanding presence had softened. No longer the loudest voice in the room, she listened more than she spoke, though her eyes often narrowed whenever the rancher addressed the group. She wasn't ready to admit defeat, but she had lost her grip on unquestioned influence. The rancher never gloated. Instead, he used his new role carefully, guiding with patience rather than force. At the next meeting, he suggested creating a heritage appreciation event where neighbors could learn about the ranch's history and enjoy a community gathering at the same time. The proposal sparked excitement. Even those who had been skeptical before nodded in agreement. It was something fresh, something that brought people together without conflict. When the day arrived, the ranch became the center of laughter and stories. Long tables were set up beneath the oak trees, filled with homemade dishes from every household. Children painted pictures of barns and cattle, while the older neighbors reminisced about the first time they had driven past the ranch years ago. Before the neighborhood grew up around it, the rancher stood back at times, simply watching. He realized this was what he had hoped for all along, not just to defend the ranch, but to make it a bridge between the past and the present. His land wasn't a wedge dividing him from the others. It was a thread that tied them together. Karen arrived late, keeping to herself at first. But eventually, curiosity drew her closer. She watched as neighbors admired the preservation certificates displayed on a table as they listened to the rancher explain the heritage breed of cattle grazing. In the pasture, she saw how people weren't bored or bothered. They were proud. By the end of the evening, even she couldn't deny the atmosphere had changed. While she didn't speak much, she didn't raise objections either. For her, silence was the closest thing to acceptance. As twilight fell and lanterns flickered beneath the branches, the rancher reflected on the journey. He thought about the folder he had carried for weeks, the papers that had once been shields but were now symbols of something larger. He no longer needed to brandish them at every turn. The truth was known, and respect had been earned. Before people left, he spoke briefly, his voice carrying gently over the hum of the gathering. "This ranch has stood for 150 years, he said. "It's not just mine. It's part of all of us now. My promise is to honor its past while working with you all for its future. Together we can make this place something we're proud to pass on." Applause rose, not polite but genuine. Neighbors clapped with smiles, children cheered, and even Karen tapped her hands softly against her clipboard. As the crowd thinned and the stars brightened overhead, the rancher sat on his porch, lantern glowing beside him. He no longer felt like the outsider defending his ground. He felt like the steward of something greater, guiding not just the ranch but the neighborhood itself toward a new understanding. The ranch was safe, its legacy secure. And with each passing day, the bonds between neighbors grew stronger, built, not on demands or conflicts, but on respect, history, and the quiet determination of a man who believed in both.